Chapter 15, Circling Back, the First Invasion. So now Isaiah's timeline is done. He's told us what will happen in the last days, from the initial earthquakes and resulting destruction, to the rise of Zion, and finally to the fall of the tyrant and the imprisoning of Lucifer. But there are still 52 chapters left. So what does Isaiah say in them? He's told us he has seen the end from the beginning of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So now he circles back to give us details of the timeline, of the very last days. And by doing so, he fills in many areas he couldn't fully develop earlier. He begins with a series of burdens or revealed difficulties that the people, both in his day and in our day, will be subject to. And as the last few verses of the timeline dealt with Judah's closest enemy to the west, Palestina, so he now turns to Judah's closest enemy to the east, Moab. Moab was a kindred people to the Jews. It was founded by Lot, Abraham's nephew, and was part of the promised land given to Abraham. King David's grandmother, Ruth, came from Moab, and as a result, she became one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. So the Moabites were a kindred covenant people, but at this time they had aligned themselves with Babylon. Isaiah says that 16 of Moab's cities would be destroyed. In fact, he says that at least 2 of these major cities would be laid waste and silenced in a single night. One of these cities, Kir, still exists today. Standing on sheer cliffs, it appears impregnable. But Isaiah says the Assyrian army would silence it in a single night. Likewise, 15 other cities were quickly vanquished. How did that happen? And why is it important for us? Isaiah often uses metaphors. For example, he used trees to represent people. He used mountains to represent kingdoms. And he also used the nations of his day to represent groups of people in our day. So let's look at what the ancient land of Moab might represent today. First, Moab serves as a metaphor for a kindred latter-day people. But which people? Moab was a regional power at the time. It had a broad, fertile plain with many vineyards. It had enough water to produce the best grapes and finest wines. It had beautiful orchards producing some of the most desired fruit in the region. It had rich stores of limestone, salt, and other minerals. It also had a great multitude, meaning a large populace. Interestingly, it also had a saltwater coast on the west, the Dead Sea, and mountains to the east of Judah. And it was separated from the covenant people by a desert. Do we have a modern equivalent? Do we know of a Gentile land filled with many kindred covenant people? Do we know of a land with beautiful vineyards and orchards, with a large population, a land rich with natural resources? And is this land separated from the leadership of the covenant capital by a desert? As Isaiah circles back to give us details about the invasion to occur after devastating earthquakes, is it possible that he is seeing a vision of the west coast of the latter-day promised land, which is North America? The American West Coast is a land of many Gentiles and many covenant people who have become rich in the things of the world. It's also a land of many earthquakes. Isaiah tells us that the initial invasion from the latter-day Assyrian will come from far, seemingly from across the ocean. When we look for a land that answers to each of these descriptions, we find that California specifically qualifies. In fact, it makes sense that any invader from over the horizon would want to silence California's largest cities and military installations in a single night. One weapon that could do that is a nuclear-charged electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP. Remember, Isaiah says that mushrooming clouds of smoke will devastate the land when the invasion comes. Whether this invasion occurs on the west coast or some other place, Isaiah makes clear that it will happen somewhere, and it will be somewhere that shares these many characteristics. Following the attack, as this chapter and the next tell us, there will be an invasion by an unstoppable army. This invasion will cause the survivors, including many women and children, to flee from town to town, to literally run for their lives. As chapters 15 and 16 continue, We learn that these survivors will run from water source to water source, from canyon to canyon, from mountaintop to mountaintop. But Isaiah then tells us that they'll find no relief, no safety, because they refuse to bow down to the God who created them. Their cries will be heard far and wide, but nothing can be done for them, as the whole nation is reeling from broken water lines to a broken economy, from broken power lines to a broken government. A recent government report indicates that up to 90% of Americans could die after a single EMP when the electrical grid is destroyed. Transportation would cease. Municipal water wells would no longer pump water to homes. Refrigeration would cease. Widespread looting would empty stores in a day, and soon local communities would descend into warfare for food. In short, chaos, violence, and death would reign. And that's before the invasion comes from far. Incredibly, this is just the first part of Moab's woes, as chapter 16 reveals the continued suffering of this once great people who are kindred to the covenant people. If you'd like to learn more about Isaiah's prophecies for our day, please go to the website, thewordsofisaiah.com. I'm Curtis Taylor with The Words of Isaiah.